So the topic of this video will be an analysis of predictive history by Jiang Xueqin and a defense of this approach against the increasing number of attacks he's been exposed to in the last few weeks since his popularity has skyrocketed. So first things first, what is predictive history as developed or depicted by Professor Jiang on his YouTube channel, Predictive History? So you have many ways of inquiring about any subject. You could start by watching the shape of something, by watching the component elements. Are they linked together? What material they're made of? You could also start by watching the results, like what's done with it. And you could also start by communicating with others, trying to get ideas as to what something is, not directly from your own experience and your own senses, but indirectly via transference of information through language. So when we inquire into whatever topic using language, one origin point that we very commonly can use for something that's already existing, that has already been categorized by others, is starting with the name. So the name Predictive History breaks down into two component pieces that we need to understand to make sense eventually of the idea using language. The first thing is we need to define history, and second we need to define prediction, and then we need to define what the juncture of the adjective and history can create, what can be predictive history. The way to do this is always either to directly inquire into something, describe something the way it is, the way we see it or understand it, or we can contrast it with what it is not, especially with the counter shape, like what appears like the completely opposite aspect of something. It's mirror image, or even like the counter form, counter shape. So in the case of predictive history, let's start with what is history. So history in language, in Roman languages, comes from all the Latin languages, comes from the Greek historia, and basically at first in Greek it comes from the title of the book by Herodotus. At least it is spread from that time on, and the title is what sounds would be histories now, but the actual meaning in Greek would be much closer to something like inquiries or questioning. It's basically a police detective work of someone who goes and explores the different countries, the different customs, different stories that are passed on different governments and so on. So it's something of a travel book mixed with what we now would specialize into geography books, history books and so on. But it's all blended because obviously the categories of present are linked to zooming in, so that is aggrandizing things a lot, while splitting them apart. So it's like a focal use of sight, and this focal use of sight makes things appear separate but are at another scale seen as one unit. So as far as the use of language goes, history is found, you've got the same name exactly in French, and for instance in French you wouldn't have what you have in English, which is a divide between history and stories. Stories and history in French are the same word. The same would appear in other languages. They have the same root even in English. So what you see with the colloquial use of history nowadays is that it covers the entire spectrum of validity of information. We use histories or stories to describe someone telling lies. In French you would say that someone is saying stories, il dit des histoires. The idea is that it's fabrication, it's a set of lies. Now if you move up the spectrum towards more validity, then stories could be works of imagination that are depicted as so. Then they could be descriptions of lived events or narratives of past events with more and more information gathered, more and more attempts to support the story by evidence or proofs or like cross-referencing testimonies and whatnot. So the more you go towards a strict depiction of what's happening in front of your eyes, the closer you get to the sense of history as an academic endeavor that tries to be a part of the soft sciences, like the social sciences. And with this attempt over the 20th century, so you have many things happening with the story of ideas. So in recent times there's a split, recent times meaning the last couple of centuries, there's a split between the humanities and science, as it's called now. And what we call science, which means basically to know, scire in Latin, we reckon that we can only know objective things we see through our eyes, and we can only know material things, for instance. The funny aspect of it is we know it through validation via mostly mathematics in our days, and mathematics is the entire opposite. It's the complete opposite of materiality and objective proof. It has a sort of objectivity, meaning that it can be observed and explored as a common by people sharing the same type of sensorium or the same type of tools, same type of language. But mathematics is entirely an abstract process, which is the exact opposite of the observable facts of the world. The idea of numbers, units, and so on are abstractions. You take something out of the experienced world and you create an idea of it. Or if you go back to Platonic origins, for instance, it's the reverse work. The materialization of something, or be it even as an idea, is already it's a manifestation of of an eidos, which is a pure ID existing in another world, like that the realm of the what we would call now the informational realm, as opposed to the material realm. So a very interesting aspect of the idea of history is the closest validity we could get is someone depicting exactly what's happening in front of his or her eyes with as much accuracy and objectivity as possible. The person will run unavoidably into a lot of problems that are inherent to the task. The first problem is the person sees only from a point of view. The person is somewhere in space and the person is somewhere in time. And what is accessible as far as information goes from one place in time and space is limited. And it's actually, except if it's to depict things that are happening really at your scale, just around you, it's very, very limited. We see history unfold now before our eyes, the potential World War III happening, maybe starting even with the Ukraine war. But what individuals that are far away from the conflict places can actually get as truthful information is very, very limited. You have the famous fog of war, you have propaganda on all sides, you have conflicting points of view, conflicting perspectives, conflicting ideas. You just know that it is most likely a mass slaughter. You can have access to pictures, but even pictures now, they've always all types of informations always have a validity aspect that is questionable. So if you were told in the Middle Ages a story about what was happening a day's ride from where you lived, about the evolution of a war or something like this, about the doings of your king or your lord, if you took it as an absolute truth, what was being told officially, for instance, or what peddlers would propagate, if you believed all stories that you were told at face value, well, you were in for a lot of troubles oftentimes. In all countries where people are used to haggling and things like this, you know that a part of the information that are transmitted will be twisted, will be at least slightly arranged to favor the objective of the person in front. But somehow, with maybe the increase of technologies, with photography and then TV and whatnot, we managed to increase this idea of objectivity as an offshoot theme of the story of science. And this covers a lot of philosophical and political debates. But what's happening now with AI, for instance, where things you see mean absolutely nothing because they can be fairly easily created with a level of accuracy that is increasing by the day. You can hear the voice of your son telling you something, and if sufficient data was collected, you could hear modalities in his voice and whatnot that would make it more and more difficult to actually identify if it's your son speaking or if it's a complete fabrication. So now we're faced with this perceived volatility of of information, which I would argue has always been part of it. But, so someone is watching something, someone is depicting something. We do not use the term history. History is not oftentimes described as an academic endeavor, as the rendition live of what's happening. Although you could say that it is the closest in the spectrum of validity to this idea of reality, objectivity, and so on. The use of history as an academic endeavor depicts the study of the past, and it depicts the study of the past in with the goal of one part of it is recreating accounts that are valid. So in some ways it's an attempt to do the reporting that we allow, that we assign to journalism now, but it's a sort of journalism into the past, into past events. And this journalism tries to make use of the remnant tracks or signs or marks that were left from this era. So mostly what's carried through would be physical remnants that are explored through archaeology, and accounts, like written accounts or stories passed down through books, which is what we assign mostly to history. Or history would weave, modern history would weave these two together more tightly. So we have one aspect of what we see in history is this validity approach. Another is the time approach. So you have stories about the future, science fiction stories. You have prospective stories, how things could unfold. And you could have predictive stories due to events, like recurrence of events and patterns that I have identified in the past. I make predictions as to what will happen in such or such situations. And this, for instance, this idea of predictive history, although it is not common parlance, it is common practice. Everybody does that. We use the store of information that we call memory, which is already not by far a perfect record once again, and we identify categories that we assign to things, people, whatnot, that come from cultural and social conditioning by language and many other things, and our own experiences. And then these would be the actors of a play being played, and we identify patterns of behavior, patterns of action, and these would be the events. They would be the interactions between the players, and they could be the lines being told by the players, and the way they will interact with the scene and with each other. So the different types of history that we see will be described in a common tool that's used in design. It would be to take the main element as a name and to complete it using adjectives or complements of nouns and things like this. So history is the center, and we see that history already has quite a broad spectrum of meanings, potential meanings. Obviously, when when Jiang Xueqin refers to history as a school teacher or as a high school teacher, he most likely refers to history as an academic endeavor. But at the same time, it can be seen from the way he does history that he's not really interested into just history as a collection of facts and dates, and he's not really preoccupied about accuracy. He's much more into historia as an inquiry, an inquiry as to maybe not the nature of the world, but as to the working of the social world, especially at the political and geopolitical scale. So social, political and geopolitical scales would refer to the workings of groups of societies, so groups of people, then the societies as type of collective superorganisms that are created by these people and that have a life of their own, and then by the greater scales that these can take, which would go in modern times to the ideas of nation states and competing superegos of nation states. So predictive history is under attack in some aspects by this idea that it is not history, and the problem would be simply, can you strictly define what history is? Can you say that your definition will last over time, since you can see that you have in the precise use of history as an academic endeavor, you can see that it has evolved and changed a lot, and you can see that it has branched out a lot. You have a lot of schools of history, a lot of ideas of how history can be done, both through authors and through time. Obviously, you compare Michelet with the practice of people we would call historians now, and you compare it to the modern practice of academics who say they do history, it would be widely different, like really deeply different. You would have a problem precising, like defining exactly the limits of what can be considered history and what cannot. You can easily attack something on the claims it makes. If the claims are false, it's fairly easy to break down an idea. But for instance, if something is presented in a fairly honest way, especially putting forward its own limitations and its own biases and its own endpoints or finalities, then it's much harder to break it down, because it's not making false claims. So when we go to history and the predictive history by Jiang Xueqin, we get this idea of design. You get the centerpiece history that's complemented by the adjective or complement of noun, here predictive. The complement of the adjective most of the time in design depict the goal, finality, the ends, or what's looked for, the intent. So you see that all the time in everyday parlance. You go to a garden, it's different if it's a botanical garden or entertainment garden, or if it's a dry garden, English garden. So you could have many different ideas. Some would depict like the actual goals pursued in the making of the garden. Others would depict types, styles, aesthetic of a type of garden that's sort of already defined. A food garden is different from conservationist garden. So the same goes here for the type of histories that we can find. We could have descriptive histories. You could have commemorative histories. You could have propaganda histories. You could have whatever you can find, the annals, analects and whatnot. So you could have types of histories that are just records of quantities, records of dates by administration. You could have administrative history, and so on and so forth. So is there one that is absolutely valid and the others that are absolutely false? This again is very difficult to argument. If someone is using history to validate claims, say in legal context or in administrative context, you need accountability, and what your history is actually an accounting. You're just describing accurately things day after day. So most of the time, people who do that are not called historians. They would be called now secretaries or things of the type. Although they provide a lot of what is the actual material of serious historians now. Other type of historians will go through literature, will go through letters, will go through biographies, and try to collect stories rather than sheer dry quantities and facts and more dried up material. They try to go for personal stories of characters, and through the crossing of information between these different accounts of lives and events, they try to reweave together a complex tapestry. But oftentimes the tapestry cannot cover all points of view. Most historians will eventually settle for one theory, which is basically one hypothesis of what was really happening. And this oftentimes is biased by political filters, by ideological filters, by sheer problems of methods and whatnot. So you would have some approaches of history which would use a lot of material, like available statistics or reconstruction of statistics using these quantities that were recorded at the times. Thomas Piketty, for instance, which is an economic. The guy is a French economist, but the work he does is very much economic history, and it's economic history with a statistical bias, meaning a statistical method, same as Emmanuel Todd. So many people would not actually necessarily be described as historians, but they will provide accounts and make sense of the past, which is one of the meaning of the actual endeavor of history. So now, if the attacks on predictive history are based on the very idea of using history not as a record of the past or as a way of inquiring into the past, but as a way of predicting the future, the so it is not commonly so commonly done by historians nowadays. They would criticize it as adventuring into soothsaying or into divination, but it is commonly done every day by everyone. From the ways you record the behaviors of your neighbors, of your co-workers and whatnot, your children, you will infer probabilities of actions. And very oftentimes you get trapped into your definition, into your categorization of events. You trap people in what they were in the past, or you trap your own abilities into what you used to think of yourself, for instance. So here we already see the dangers, some of the actual valid arguments for a critic, but a constructive critic of the idea of predictive history. So obviously the past does not always cover the future. Patterns, which means recurrences, or schemes of things that are steadily recurring in different contexts. Patterns that are identified are not, strictly speaking, repeating exactly all the time. So if a pattern comes from the name patron, and it's you can think of a weaving pattern which you put on the loom, and you can create and recreate the same shapes, the same appearances. In real life, there is no pattern that exactly recopies itself, but you have a lot of things that you do expect. There's a patterning to your experience of the world. All the things that we call memory is a recollection of patterns. It's pattern identification, and then inference that is unprovable of the fact that this pattern will persist in time. And the only thing that provides the strong validity is the experienced or perceived experience of repetition and commonality, and the center of consciousness that seems to be maintaining a level of identity through all the process. If your mind of child, if your mind as a baby was transmitted all of a sudden into your modern, your actual present, both body and mind, it would be meeting, if a baby mind had the categories to perceive or understand anything of your own mind and your own world, it would be meeting a complete stranger. It would not identify any continuity. But the sequence and the boiling frog effect of everyday life makes it so that the story unfolds line by line, word by word, page by page, chapter by chapter, and it seems as though there's a continuity. But if you jump from just a few lines at the beginning to a few lines at the end, the entire story would make no sense, and you would not see the commonalities. You would not see the unity into the narrative. So the same goes here with the use and problems of using pattern language to explain the past, which is already problematic, since we use patterns that are created with ideas, words, and ways of perceiving the world that come from now and are projected back into the past. The same goes for the future. We infer like stability or recurrences, but the further you go, the more you know that things will be immensely different, and at the same time they share commonalities. So as an absolute, the idea of using the past to predict the future as an absolute is false if it's a dual value question. But as a relative statement, it's a fact of life. It's the only way you can navigate through life, is using past experiences to infer workings of the world, workings of the people around you, and from that prepare your plans of life. The fact that you go to work instead of basking in the sun is because you, through memory and through this identification of patterns, you get the idea that if you don't, you will lack something, you will lack food, you will lack money, and then you infer other things from past events. If I lack money, then such or such things should happen. Someone will come and kick me out of my place or whatnot, and then I will leave such or such. All these things are possible only via this process of abstraction and this projection into the future. But you don't know for a fact. You have no idea of what could happen. You don't pay. Maybe there's a revolution the next day. No one comes at your door, at least not the ones you were expecting. Maybe you're dead in the night. So it's practically necessary to do this. And the critique that is made is mostly a critique based on the division of labor pushed into a tiny portion of a very broad division of labor into the fields of knowledge. Into the fields of knowledge, it breaks down into several big categories, several big branches. At the tip of these branches breaks down into twigs. So history would be a branch of middle size in the branching of knowledge, and they're the way we think about history just now would just be a couple of leaves at the end of the twig, or maybe not exactly that, because it's still evolving. So it will be new shoots from burgeons that are fairly recent. So this attack to me is not really deep. It has, if things were not presented as attempts to undermine other people's and to strawman other people's inquiries or attempts at making sense of the world, and still man's one's own, especially when supporting it by the fact that you're part of the academia. So you basically, you worked and you paid and you just basically followed the cursus that provided you with a diploma, which is a self-referencing medium of validation. It doesn't mean that it has no value, but the idea that the only person who could explore the realm of history are professionals that have these that have followed the beaten path. Well, there's a lot of good arguments for it. So for instance, you would not fly with a pilot that has not been properly trained. But then, do all the best pilots come from schools, piloting schools? No, especially if you go back in time, because the schools, like the beaten paths that you're supposed to follow now to get recognized when you go back in time, obviously the first people to open up the path had no diploma, they had no structures of self-validation. They were opening new realms of inquiries or new methods of inquiry. A lot of the people that are the classics now at their time were dangerous revolutionaries or misfits. So closing up, you need in all systems obviously conservation and adaptation or novelty, so innovation. You need a link to the past, and you need to maintain what has worked. If you dissolved all types of conservation and memory and patterns, you would dissolve into nothingness. The very meaning of existence is being out of, away from, or originating from something else, needs a reference to this origin and needs a differentiation. So the reference to the origin and the differentiation would cover conservation and change. If the very notion of being, of identifying something, means that you need a memory of this, and you need to make it exist through time. Otherwise, it's just the flickering of flames, the games of the smoke, the embers, the light in the fire, which at some scale of perception we are, but at the scale of perception that we take for our own lives, that's not what's happening. We perceive continuity, we perceive conservation. If this conservation of the past is too strong, then nothing can change. And then if nothing could change at all, there would be no time, because obviously time is a perception of change happening in a continuity. You have a unity, and then you have the breaking down of this unity in differences. And these differences, the more differences you perceive, the more events, the more activity, and the more measure of time you have. That's so that's also I do not deem my arguments to be of any more value than any others. The thing that I find very unsavory in the realm of debates nowadays is this perception that diversity is a problem, and we try to bring back people into conformity with our own views. So we would be, I do not have very, very broad knowledge of the internet realm, even less of social media. I'm not from this era, but I've delved into it in the last 2 or 3 years more, because you have a lot of very deep and interesting content. At the same time, the way people interact together is very, very problematic. Diversity is not a decoration in nature. When we lose species, it's not just that we lost a garland or whatever type of garment that was making things just more beautiful, although beauty would serve a lot of functions too. But diversity is the only thing that allows for complex systems to weave themselves together. If you have a monoculture of any type, a monoculture of ideas, a monoculture of like food, like production, agriculture, the problems you find will always be the same, and they are impossible to resolve. If you have the same beings in the same place, doing the same things, needing the same say food, for instance, same nutrients, extruding or leaving the same waste with the same desires, same taste, same preferences, they change the medium in the same way, they are in direct competition for the same things, they deplete the medium of the same nutrients or same resources, they saturate the medium with the same refuse, and they have the same dead angles, same secondary effects, same dead angle, same biases, same drifts, same shadows. So basically, the more things are the same, the more they are both in direct competition with each other, because they are absolute competitors. It's like you have one thing, say that only one thing of this type can exist in a medium, and your copy is the worst competitor you could find. There's absolutely no diversity of tools, of characteristics, of experiences that would help you validate your difference, and that would provide you with what you really are in life, which is a unique treasure at any time, due to the sheer diversity of experiences, of creativity, of perspective, sensibility, and so on. Each thing, each person is at any time a unique treasure. If you are copies of copies of copies, if you restrict a lot the diversity, you're just making a lot of copies. So you have these double aspects. The more commonalities are shared, the easier the communication. It's very easy to understand that. It's relatively easier to understand someone or something that is very, very close to you in the ways of perceiving the world, thinking in the experiences and whatnot, culture, than someone or something that is completely alien. The further away something is from you, the more estranged you would be if you met it. So you meet again these polarities that are necessary to make things exist, but that are at the same time the complexities that we need to navigate, we need to surf. If you have too many differences, there's no communication, there's no process of making things common possible. If you have too few, then you basically have not sufficient diversity to weave things together. Your systems will just run down very fast. You pile up your own flaws, or your own it's not even flaws, because even the good things that you have to bring, you're a car, you can drive forward, you can move. If you have too much of this propelling movement and nothing to stop it, no brakes, no ways of stopping the car, then obviously you lost the entire ability to navigate or to use it. The same would go if you had a steering wheel and you can turn the wheel only in one direction. Your ability to navigate change or navigate the existing landscape becomes much reduced. you need others that see into your shadow, that see into your back, that can perceive the drifts and the secondary effect and your own biases that are you're blinded to it by nature. And I say you, it's me. So we need others, and we need especially the ones that are completely opposite to us. So the fact that someone would come from Professor Jiang comes from academia. He comes from the Ivy League. He comes from very validated pathways into the big forest of self-validation in societies. But due to his own differences and this unique treasure made him sink for a stretch, and he drifted away from it. Then he left what's perceived as the center of culture, which is the West, and especially America, to go into the backwaters of the enemy, which is China, which obviously is like it's a Western-centric perspective, that it's completely outdated somehow. Although you could argue, as he would most likely, that China is basically a Western country too. The culture is much less influenced by all the unique treasure of the actual Eastern world than it is fed by the colonization of thought and culture and society. That's so. The fact that he's not a professor, he's not teaching in universities. He has a BA only and not a doctorate. So this also is very strange. It's called cognitive bias in many ways, but people trade cognitive biases all the time to try to invalidate each other. So if he was claiming to be a university professor and trying to validate his views and trying to push his views into competing like scholars, for instance, then the thing would be very problematic. But the fact that he's called professor is just a moniker that's been given to him on the internet, on his YouTube channel, by people who were paying respect to the fact that they felt enriched by the content he was providing. So attacking him on this aspect, especially since you could, if you watch old videos before he got famous, the guy is obviously not bragging about it, and he's never describing himself as a professor, for instance. It depicts the fact that he's teaching in a high school, which is the first time you discover that is quite surprising. But in trying to invalidate the content and trying to invalidate the validity of the content that he provides. So when I say validity, I use another name. It's not the accuracy, but it's the fact that the people that listen to this, the young people or older people, find the wealth of information, of perspectives, of ways of exploring the world of ideas and the world of history that they think enrich them. So now you can see a lot of academics which are submitted at their own levels in the academia, say in universities. They submit it to the same things Professor Jiang experiences with his own pupils, which is that a lot of them do not care, do not show up, do not participate, or basically it's compulsory education. But on the internet, it's not compulsory education. People who listen, they want to listen. People who listen to 1 hour lectures, especially if they're young people that have been very young people of the modern era, whose span, like the attention span, is reduced by the constant use of whatever TikTok or things that go very fast. You can see that a lot of them find deep value in things like this and stick to not only entire lectures but entire courses, and they get a type of education that couldn't be provided for them due to social status, due to lack of interest, and they get it from the content he provides. So now the fact that it's seen as competition by other providers of content, especially official providers of official content, is understandable. But trying to debase something because you do not see the value of it is of little consequence, little importance, or little value. So if we go into the actual methods that Professor Jiang uses and what he claims about what he does. So when he goes into some detail in depicting the idea of predictive history, you have a couple of things. The origin of it is the ideas from Isaac Asimov about psychohistory. So it's foundation books. Psychohistory is the idea that you can, over very long periods of time, using things that now would be called big data and AI treatment, you can identify for large groups of people very broad patterns that can tell you in which direction human history is going to go. And it can be used to, it's been a while since, actually a long time since I read the books when I was young, but I still remember some of it. So basically it can be used to navigate somehow history, or try to orient it in some ways. So there's this source, and then you have the study of modern methods, whatnot, and then it goes to the model that he commonly transmits to his pupils, which is based on 3 things: game theory, patterns in history, identified through history, and eschatology. So the 3 things serve different functions. If you picture history as a trip, as a long winding trip through the universe, you'd have origin points, and you'd have all the stages you walk through. You would have the way itself, the actual movement through this universe, which implies functions, vehicle functions, everyday functions that you need to maintain to be able to keep your trip going. And you have destinations, you have goals, you have places you try to reach. And these places can be at several different scales. You can have the end point, like the furthest destination you can think of, which eventually for a trip would be your arrival point, the place where your the voyage ends. So this could be your death, for instance, is the end of the journey of your life. So, beginning, middle, end. Beginning is history, memory, patterns. This is all the things that have happened on the way. It's both the journal of the long journey, the trip, it's the maps, it's the identification of regularities, of recurrences. Game theory is a part of this map, but it's the part of the map that's linked to how things work, how things are moving in this journey. Are the other ships or other vehicles moving, will act, how you will interact with them or with your environment and whatnot. So it's definition of how things will unfold day after day. Eschatologies, so eschaton in Greek means the end, finality. So eschatologies are the idea of this intent, these finalities you put behind the actions you do. So it's where you're going. So eschatology is a word that's used mostly in religious language, mostly only in religious language. But if you picture the entire thing as a vector, so the origin point would be the starting point of a vector, then you have the pathway, which is the line, and then you have the direction. You have the end point, and you have in which sense you go. So the small arrow at the end will give you the direction. So the entire process can be thought of as a sort of force diagram, where you're trying to identify vectors, interacting vectors, so vector fields that influence the movements of different elements and the change of the entire landscape. Jiang Xueqin is not directly using this idea of vectors, but what it depicts is game theory is the frame that it uses to model, which is always obviously a simplification and categorization, the interactions of actors at the social level, political level, geopolitical level. So this is based on basically it's a mathematical framework, what's called games. So it's based on the work by von Neumann and people like Nash, which was a very interesting paranoid mathematician. And the idea is that you can map interactions of players, of actors, the actors that are conscious, but they have a say, they have a way of influencing what happens. It's a big difference between everyday people. So most of us in our lives, to quote Thoreau, we live lives of quiet desperation, maybe not to this stage, although increasingly so maybe. The only thing is that most of us, life is something that happens to us. It is not really necessarily something that we are doing in the way of, we're not shaping it as a storyteller would shape or would create a story. it's not something we feel we have a lot of agency upon. Oftentimes we end up with a feeling of being submitted to events, submitted to the initial conditions, submitted to what happens to us. We do not think of it all the time as what we do. So obviously here also you have another of these polarities, reconciling dual opposites in a unity where you have a spectrum linking and mixing opposite values. So obviously you perceive you have modicum of agency, but also you perceive that a lot of things are not under your control. And the more specialized and the more estranged from nature and biology the world is, in some ways the less we have agency upon it. In other ways, since you create fantasy, like we create virtual worlds, people who play games, play video games, play it notably because they feel they have a lot of agency there. You can create dream lives. Before I started traveling, I lived through books and role-playing games, and these role-playing games were basically structured as they were structures. They used the structures of all societies, like archetypal cultural elements, including the role-playing game, that are found in most long-lasting societies. You start with a character that has a deep feeling of agency because you know you're here to play. So you have a modicum of you have a sort of control over these dualities of association, dissociation, distanciation, and approaching, or identification and differentiation, exteriorization, internalization, and so on. All these things that are common movements of our psyches and bodies. In the game, you have more control over it than you have in your everyday life. It's very, very easy to perceive the lives we live as games, and especially as role-playing games. You go to your work, you play a role, which is different from the role you play with your parents, with your spouse, with your children, with your friends, and so on. So we put masks, a persona, that's the name personnage, which is character in English. All these things are very, very close. So when you play and when you're in games, you know that your choices matter, and you know that you can influence the course of a game. The more broken you've been by education, by events and whatnot, the less agency you perceive on what you are, what you do, and what you can change, where you can go, and what you perceive, what you think, and what you want. So these three layers of matter, energy, information that are very commonly used in many forms in different cultures. You would very easily lose the feeling that you have agency, capacity, ability, and freedom to do things there, to act there. So the game theory, the fact that you try to identify people who perceive themselves as players, peoples or social organizations, then you need to understand the type of games that is being played. Is it a competitive game, collaborative game, a war game, like you have a strategy game? Is it a knowledge game, whatnot? All the types of games you could think of. Now you need to identify in the typologies of the games part of link to this matrix of relationship that you could stick to the game. Is it a game of, so as I said, competition, of predation? Is it a game of mutualism, collaboration, symbiosis? So all the ecological matrices that are used with plus minus zero, neutralism being zero, they could be translated into finalities of games. For instance, what type of relationship is sought after in between the players or with the actual game? Do you need to create something? Do you need to destroy something or to resist something? What not? You have a lot of options, and there you need to discover if a type of game means basically that the more you have, if it's they call zero-sum game and things like this. So maybe I won't go into much more details. It's fairly easy to get a grasp on what game theory is. The thing is, Professor Jiang actually does not use game theory as it is thought of, the same as he doesn't use history as it is commonly defined. He doesn't use game theory as it is commonly defined by people specializing in it. Although he has knowledge of it, he doesn't use the math of it. It's basically a mathematic framework. He uses the idea and then he makes it his own. And he uses the parts that are helpful to his models. So when he's depicting the game theory, he's trying to identify, as I mentioned, the player, the type of games that are played, maybe the scale of the game. Then he's trying to identify for each player the incentives and the goals. So incentives and motivations, it's what pushes you, what makes you move. The goals, that what is linked to this, it's what you want to grasp, what you want to attain. It's these finalities I was mentioning before. And the incentives can be intrinsic or extrinsic. They can come from the inside or from the outside, or oftentimes they're interwoven. So the humiliations that you see, someone like Trump has lived, say when he was humiliated by Obama at one point, this becomes, so this is a past event, but this becomes an incentive. It's a cause that becomes a goal, and your goal is revenge. So all these things you identify, then you need to identify the strategies, and you need to identify the types of moves, the type of actions that can be taken. The strategies are the plans, the grand plans that can be organized together and that link together units of actions. And there beyond you may have things like the different rewards you can get or penalties. So you can zoom in and get a lot of detail and you get a lot of differentiation, or you can zoom out and create broad generalities that are helpful although imprecise, while if you go deep into the complexity of things become much more defined. The definition of your screen shows more and more pixels, but then it's also you're zoomed into the picture and it's very difficult to get a broad idea of anything. So that's one aspect that we find also into this debate about history, is the guy is a broad spectrum approach of things in between domains, so basically he's moving around the branches of these big trees of of human activity, mostly into he limits it to mostly the branches of knowledge, or the tree of knowledge. It doesn't jump like I would do in between practices or everyday physical work or craftsmanship and internal work or metaphysics and whatnot, but already in the field of intellectual knowledge, he will tie religious and metaphysical endeavors or explorations, metaphysics to sciences. There's less focus on science, which makes him what I call hard sciences, which makes him by nature invalid into the framework of big ways of thinking about the world that are common now, that are dominant now. So that's game theory. You try to see what's being played, so how pieces are moved into the board, and you in between the origin point and the end point, in between the causes and the initial situations and the goals or the end game. Now the second part, the one that is not so under attack, maybe would, well, the second part is the patterns of history idea. So there again, every way of thinking about anything is a memory attached to words, to tags. So it's a bag in which we put a certain amount of content of certain nature. The borders of the bag are more or less porous, so they limit the entrance of some things and the exit of things that are defined by the size of the mesh, for instance. So there we get a few of the issues that are pushed against Professor Jiang and Jiang Xueqin. So one aspect is, what is the quality of the things you put in the bags? Another aspect is what these ideas of patterns. So what is the validity of the recurrences that you use or imply? And you have others, but let's explore these two. So first thing first, the pattern aspect. So you have many different ways of looking at the world. You can look at the world by trying to make sense of it, trying to weave different individual pieces into big picture. Once again, we get back to some iterations or some manifestation of this process of zooming in, zooming out, or focusing, which is basically concentrating, getting a lot of information on few things or small period of time, small space, small number of things considered. So that I focus on my finger, the tip of my finger. I focus my eyes more and more. I strain my gaze, and I start to see the small component parts of the tip of my finger. But I lose the big picture, obviously. Now I do the reverse. I look past my finger, past the screen. Each time I go past something, there's an opening of my field of perception, and at the same time things become more blurry. The borders between things, the definition of things, that creates strong identities. When I zoom, I see clearly an in-between that marks the end of one thing and the beginning of the next. When I take peripheral vision or eagle vision, global vision, That's the reverse. I distribute the information. It's the opposite of concentrating. So you have several moves that can happen. Either I decentralize. So decentralize would be I take several points of focus and I spread the amount of awareness or perception I can use, and I distribute it in between. I split it in between. Distributing would mean that I cover an entire area and I equalize the field of knowledge there. And the peripheral aspect would mean that I send perception to the edges and try to stretch from there to widen the field of my perception, my awareness, of my consciousness. So basically, the thing to remember is a lot of information on few things, few informations on a lot of things. If I have few informations on a lot of things, what appear will be the relationships. So if you try to catch a ball, you go for focal vision, the ball hits you. For practical reasons, in the way your eyes work and your sight works. If you go peripheral, you can catch a ball directly. But if your body is not locked, it's the type of perception you use to perceive movement. Hence, relationship. So, relationship between things and how they change. So, someone who's using a broad spectrum, it seems to the outside, if your culture is completely based on centralization, concentration, focusing, the especially strict use of sight, microscopes, like increasing the definition, getting more and more, and breaking down things so that you can get more detail. So that's part of the idea of reductionism. If you think you can understand the world by understanding its smaller or smallest component parts, then it's obvious that the entire endeavor of knowledge will be to zoom in, acquire more technology or more methodologies, more techniques of breaking things down into smaller and smaller pieces and getting more and more detail on this. What happens when you do that? You become very finicky. You become very you cannot talk to the everyday people, for instance, because what you're describing is something that is out of the common human perception, common human experience. You're describing something that is so small and so specialized, so out of the big picture of things, that it's basically useless to most people at the scale at which they live their lives. So now, when you go the other way around and you have someone who describes the world from outer space, that's the same would appear. If someone describes the world from the top of a mountain, then it could prove fairly useful. The scales are not so immensely different. It could map out the global overlay of the land and describe pathways and like relationships between places that can have practical uses for everyday life. But if someone goes into outer space or sees the Earth from further away, the Earth becomes just a tiny speck of dust, then becomes nothing past the point. So what would be if someone goes from the widest picture, if he was trying to communicate to people who perceive just the average and same scale events, the same problem would appear. The person would speak in terms that are perceived as way too general. The Earth from way up is just one thing, and then it's nothing. So if someone was just describing it, but you live on Earth, and you know that the Earth is many things, you know that there's all this diversity, goes with exchange, and the person who speaks from way out in space tells you that it's not many things. All these things are small component parts, but it's actually just one thing interacting with other things of pretty much the same scale, other planets, and eventually they're also past a point they become nothing again. So the person would be perceived as difficult to speak to as the specialist. So the generalist, someone who sees everything together, all the different places, all the different you can see from the top of the mountain both the field, that's the only thing that someone that is working the field can see. You see the field, you see the forest, you see the distance, you see the valley, you see the rivers, you see their links, you see how they shape together the overall bioregion, lay of the land, whatnot, the relationship between the weather and the shaping of all this. So it would be very difficult for people that are just completely immersed into all these different places and parts to link them together through your story. Because for them, obviously, it's not you in the forest. You have a lot of detail. To know the forest, you need to know many things. You can see when you talk to someone from the city or the field that they do not know anything about it. It's completely different. And then you have someone who depicts the fact that it's flowing one into the other and interacting together and whatnot, and you just perceive that it's nonsense because you've never actually changed perspective, changed scale. So if you pictured the worst type of conversation possible, it would be between people that are completely zoomed in, absolute specialist, and people that are completely zoomed out, absolute generalist. So physicians of particles and metaphysicians of what's beyond physics, beyond the universe. They can vary, although they, in some ways they would share a lot of commonalities, but oftentimes if they never experienced other perspectives and if they got trapped into their own ways of thinking, of perceiving, of doing things, they will perceive what the others mention as complete nonsense. If someone is perceiving entirely the material world and another one perceives only the flows, only the dynamics of things, or only the vibrations, only the whatnot, especially if you perceive something that has no category in the language of the lived experience of someone, it will be perceived as complete bullshit. So that's the main problem you would see between some types of specialists of history and what Professor Jiang does, because what he does is very blurry. It's very often quite ill-defined. There's a lot of room for imagination, which is something that is perceived as a completely invalid at the scale of it's not only the zoom there, but if you use a materialist framework, the idea of using just sheer ideas, or even worse, power of imagination, of creating things to depict what is. You're interested in what is. and then someone tells you that to perceive the working of what is at some level, you need to use, or it's very useful to use your imagination. Although many of your big scientists did say that, they're people from history, and the way we do science now, the serious stuff, is perceived as very different. So that's another place where it'll be attacked a lot. So now, if we're back to these patterns of histories, in the pattern of histories, there's also the problem of, to identify pattern, first you need to take occurrences and then create generalities from many occurrences. So if someone perceives that your occurrences are wrong, it's this big problem of the perception of the validity of the facts that you're using to develop, to deduct these big categories of events that you call pattern. This again is not something specific to Professor Jiang, and there you would see the big issue with the way professional specialists in academia are taught now. So the zooming in and the concentration on very few topics mean that obviously you lost a lot, for most people, a lot of the diversity of a training. Very few people have any knowledge of the fact that the entire frameworks of mathematics and whatnot is completely tied to philosophy. That philosophy is indistinguishable, if you go back in time, from the things that now are debased as hermeticism, occultism, esotericism, religiosity, and so on. These things, they were not different realms. They were the same endeavors, the same attempts at trying to make sense of the world, identifying patterns. So now we decided that a certain type of patterns were valid and that many others were invalid. And we have much more accuracy. So if we're looking at material events, at facts and so on, at accuracy of recordings. So now we have much more than prior. So since we have much more, we tend to perceive the past as just people that were deeply deluded. So there again, there's a big issue for people with some experience in the diversity of cultures, diversity of ways of perceiving and interacting with the world. When you hear people, even top academics, talk about the past as a bunch of raving loonies, but fortunately fighting against the unraveling of science as a pre-existing fact, and that fortunately you had heroes fighting for the resistance, the rebels that managed to fight the darkness so that the truth could emerge, and the truth is where we are now. And since we reached the truth, we are at the top of the mountain. There's nothing beyond. So a lot of people do what other academics of their times have done. They stick to their ground. They stick to the familiar. Many do not do that, obviously, but in strong debates, a lot of people get entrenched in their ways. Since they meet people that speak a completely different language and that very often are themselves completely locked up into their inner walls, we're basically in all these culture wars and whatnot, which is leading eventually to actual wars, civil wars, and it's unavoidable. If we cannot if we cannot communicate because we cannot perceive commons, and from the commons shared and the communications allowed, we cannot establish communities, and from communities eventually establish alliances, associations, and friendships leading to societies. There's no way out these strict divides of the world. If I'm right, you're wrong, it leads only to one thing. I'll force you to think my way or the highway. And my way or the highway, if the other one doesn't want, eventually it's the war. It can be intellectual war, it can devolve into military wars, as we see, although causes may be slightly different, but not so much if you go about it. So that's so much for the attacks on Professor Jiang, for the accuracy of these facts, the accuracy of the elements, since he's not a specialist. When his course on civilization covers mostly Western civilization, since basically Professor Jiang is Western taught, of Western cultures primarily, and doesn't go, it takes one personal approach. He appropriates deeply the content, which is also something with which a lot of people resonate, and it's something that will make the people who think that you need that's only some types of ways of thinking about the world are valid, it will make them crazy. Because you perceive people as claiming an authority that you deem they lack. So all the systems of validations that I was mentioning prior, they're deeply at work there, and they tie to many other things, like if you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get an education so that you could get a few steps ahead from others in the rat race, the big competition for social status and property and whatnot, then obviously you do not want anyone to reach an equal status without having done the sacrifices, or having paid the price, or having the right connections too. So there again, the revolutionaries, or the innovators, the wide thinkers, the dialectic is oftentimes a war between these and the conservationist people who try to, or the more tedious and the conservative thinkers more precise. But once again, if you look at it deeply, it is a complementary game of opposites. But the game of opposites is complementary only if you can make them work together, if you can steer in between. And you do not need the extreme positions. Also, you need to be able to move freely in between all these positions, to mix them. And for that, except if you have people who can cover the entire spectrum, which is nigh impossible, you would need people or institutions and whatnot in all the spectrum, practicing all these different ways of being, ways of interacting and thinking about or perceiving the world and making sense of it. So once again, the diversity issue. Next and last part of this method is the one that comes under the worst waves of criticism, is the eschatology approach. So there, it's the worst type. You get a guy using names coming from religious religious vocabulary into something that tries to validate itself, a soft science that tries to validate itself in reference to the methods of the hard sciences, of physics, for instance. So there we could go into a lot of depth about the big issues with all the idea of one scientific method and whatnot. In many ways, what Professor Jiang does is the strict application of the scientific method in its most common rendition, which is you do observations, then from these observations you create models. From these models you create hypotheses of how things should play out, or how things should have worked out if you go back in time, and you go back to a point in time and you do not know exactly the sequel for a stretch. You apply your model and you derive hypotheses, and then if you get the information about the past, you can see two things for past and present, or past and future. Either your hypotheses are validated, which will increase the perception of validity of your model, or they are invalidated, which will decrease the validity and the trust you can have in your model, and push you from there. You have your results, you see this validation, invalidation, and then you have the feedback loops where you reiterate the process, you go back. So this is taken as a new type of perception and information. You go back to the beginning, you change your models, or you discard entirely your model, and you reiterate. And basically science in this way is a reiterated question. And history in this way is an ongoing inquiry. It's an ongoing police operation. You're looking for the end of the case, but it will never ever be solved completely. You do not dissolve the thing you're looking at when it's on such scale. So now the problem with eschatology comes from religions. You have the culture war. Religion is perceived as a completely invalid way of approaching the world by many scientists. You have all these debates about creationism against evolutionism and whatnot. Oftentimes a very quite shallow understanding of the different the diversity of the points of view, the diversity of all traditions, and their own the depth and the diversity, the scope and the depth of the different subjects on both sides. But doesn't matter for now. So here the eschatology, the way describe the ends, the final points of history, for instance. So it's often linked to prophecy, and here again prophecy, you get another big issue, which is we think of it as prophet. We think of it as saying the future. But prophets in the Bible, for instance, were not forcibly at all. If you go to the Hebrew tradition and you explore it, you could get to content by Justin Sledge that summarizes many of the research on this. You'd see that in the culture of the time, prophets were seldom accurate in the depiction of futures that they were describing, but they were much more critics of the perceived flaws and drifts of the present, and they were alerting population to the loss, like the idea that they were losing their ways, losing their values and whatnot, and depicting future events where a deep or strong reckoning would happen. So, for instance, you would go to apocalyptic times. And since we're living apocalypses now, we find the same problem with predictive history, with Professor Jiang being described as a prophet because he made predictions that were proved right. The events that he predicted came to be. So now we have a lot of issues. One thing is the nature of prophecy. In the same way a prophet of the past was prophets that you see in the Bible oftentimes are proved wrong. Like it's second, and I'm not no expert at all on the Bible, so I refer to see works of specialists. But so if these prophets do not actually depict the future, and they depict the futures that they depict are renditions of big paybacks for the perceived wrongs that were accumulated by the social forces or individuals, and you get to, for instance, apocalypses. Apocalypses are thought of now as the end of time, as the complete destruction of the world and things like this, because we use it through the language, the common language, and through references to things like nuclear apocalypse. But in prior times, apocalypse means a revelation. So it's basically it's unveiling, revealing the actual goals of the deep force that presides all, like the God or gods, the Elohims, and it can be also a change of world, like you go from one world to the next. You have the destruction of one world or one humanity, as you see in many stories in Greek mythologies, for instance, the men of gold going to the men of bronze or whatnot, and the different worlds in Mayan mythologies, or many different American mythologies and others. You see with Ragnarok, with the Vikings, the death of the one type of order and the creation of another. So now we are living in apocalyptic times, and we see some people will see Professor Jiang as a prophet, and there you have many ways it goes. So one way is, in many ways, he is a prophet, but he is a prophet in the more literal meaning of the word, which is someone pointing at several flaws or dangers or drifts of societies. And once again, these drifts, these shadows, are inherent to the existence of anything, and they pile up over time. There's no easy way to avoid that for individuals. As for, you need to recreate yourself, you need to reconstruct yourself to avoid the worst of it. But it's much more difficult for societies over time, and more complex societies like empires, world empires, it becomes really, really difficult. As Sadhguru used to say, for the mechanic and the surgeon, when the mechanic didn't want to give back the car because he thought the surgeon was making at least 1,000 times more money than he was for the same work of repairing. One was repairing beings, humans, the other was repairing cars. So why the discrepancy in between the salaries obtained? And the answer of the surgeon in the story is that try fixing them while they work. Try fixing them while they're running. So that's the problem we're in. Professor Jiang makes sense of a lot of things, and the making sense there again is, if you think that people who describe historical theories and science and whatnot are telling the truth, then you face, at least in the mental structure, mental way of seeing the world, then it's impossible to prove. All words that you use are somewhat arbitrary in this mental approach. You could use other categories. You do see other languages, although disappearing, that have other categories to describe the world. So you're basically creating different pieces of a puzzle, and your puzzle has multiple dimensions, so it doesn't overlap. You cannot prove that your ways of making sense of the world are true. But the big problem is you can prove they are efficient. You can use theories to create artifacts, for instance. You can go from science to technology, which is thought now as a completely mixed medium, which was not prior to the 19th century. It's fairly recent, the interweaving of all these in such a way. So prior to that, you could basically develop ways of doing without having ways of thinking about them that would be recognized now as scientific. But so whatever, here the problem of Professor Jiang is, if people, especially young people, confuse a sense-making endeavor that helps navigate the world, and navigate the world through predicting the potential actions of big players, and provide agency to small players, small individual people stuck into nation states, stuck into the big revelations of the workings of power through things like the Epstein's files. But you could go back, if people delve deeply into the WikiLeaks and others, they would have the same experience. You discover that you feel completely disempowered. You feel disempowered, you feel lost, and you feel this breaking down of structure of your entire perception of the world. Someone comes in and brings clarity to it. It brings a light or a filter of perception that allows you to make sense of what you lived, and eventually, as you could feel in a strong part of what he's trying to do is give back, is empower people, at least in their mental life. And from their mental life, if you can think the world and perceive the world differently, hopefully you can act on your life in certain ways, and take responsibility and ability to act upon it. So that's something that he would say. But then you have one big issue, which is that people can confuse models with realities. They confuse prediction with reading a pre-written script of the future. And in the way Professor Jiang tells his stories in class, or even in podcast now, oftentimes the limit seems blurry. So if people take a prophet at face value, they do not become empowered. You get into the June paradox, or the old paradox that you find in many of the Greek tragedies, like Oedipus. You have a soothsayer, you have some person accessing divination, telling you the future. You try to act upon this information, and while doing so, you create the future you were trying to you were trying to avoid. So that's the one big theme of the Dune series by Frank Herbert, amongst many other deep themes. There's this strong idea of the trap of prediction. You're able to see the future, you're trapped into your vision of what will be, and you try to influence what happens to avoid it, but you can never know if you changed the things, and you can never know if they were true. If you didn't change the thing, then you can never know if you didn't, if you're not the one responsible for actually shaping them that way, because you were trying to avoid this pitfall. You walk straight into it. So there, since Professor Jiang is getting a lot of pressure with popularity, a lot of attacks. Some attacks are very funny too. So some attacks would be character-based assassination. So it's the common rhetoric attacks, where the guy would be a spy or an influencer financed by whatever power, like the Communist Party or the Mossad or the USSR. And there again, that's very interesting. If you cannot invalidate directly the content, some people attack the content, some people attack the methods, and some people attack the character. The character, it can be attacked by his ethos, the validity, the confidence that you have in someone through his status, through here, for instance, the fact that you have the diplomas, the fact that you're well known by, you have the peer review, all the inner validations that are somewhat useful too in their original forms. So you would have attacks on the ethos. You cannot believe this guy because he's just a misfit and whatnot. Attack on the logos, the actual language, the actual logic, the actual arguments, the actual content. Blurry things, invalid logic. That is so there. It's the attack on the method, the content, and so on. A lot of these attacks are fairly weak. The guy is basically giving a course in high school. The people who provide these attacks, a lot of them are into education. So a lot of them are making the attacks. I'd be interested to see exactly the level of the people in their own classes, the level of interest, the level of commitment. It's not easy to teach when you force people to learn. If you try to learn something that you do not need and do not want, it becomes very, very difficult. So when you teach, you try to make sure you try to make sure that people will want to listen to, will want to participate. So if you get bogged down into all the finicky details of the story and you go for full-on academic pedantry, that would be meaningful only for specialists, you've lost all your audience right away. So the fact that there are a lot of issues of accuracy, jumping too fast, not explaining all the workings of the thinking and all that, that's a big part of it would come from the context. Another would come from the actual way of working of Professor Jiang himself, but he's clear about it. He describes what he does, and he is clear about some of the flaws. Same as any person, he can get trapped into his own validation biases, especially when you get 2,300,000 people listening to your words. You would tend to maybe lose a bit of perspective, and but at the same time, as he mentions, he goes for imagination, but also dialogue and seeking out other perspectives, and it doesn't shy away from debate if they're well intended. So anyhow, to summarize and finish this very lengthy exploration, the guy may be wrong on several things. He may be wrong about the predictions he makes. So in some of his courses, he described how maybe he's completely wrong and no one should listen to him, and he's an idiot and whatnot. So that's this got a lot of answers, and most people do not get from his lessons depictions of the future that is coming, especially since the future that is coming that could be described is mostly for the world we live in. It's an apocalypse, and it's even for most personal lives, it's a potential big mess. So they're not getting that. They're getting this feeling of structuring the thinking, getting new ideas. Eventually, if they resonate with the character, the fact that the guy is open about all, like, is one of the deep misfits that display power through the internet. I found him by listening to Kellen Morgan from Formscapes, which is another very, very deep and interesting voice of this medium that I'm not really, I was not really very familiar with. And voices like this are people that have a completely different background from the one you expect, from the voices you hear all the time. Because they're people that are not valid into the framework of society. Their ethos is not high. They come from somehow nowhere. But the content, or in the case of Kellen Morgan, also the craftsmanship, but the same would apply to Professor Jiang for the rhythm and the pace and intensity of his lessons. There's craftsmanship there. So both, and many other people like Whitney Webb, completely different ways of going about things. They provide very, very deep things to people. Yeah, but same as Gabor Mate, all the people of Sand, all the people of the Age Shields, millions and millions of people are providing millions of tiny pieces that are completely necessary for the reinvention of our world, be them ongoing, which is very unlikely, or after they break down into broken shards, which is more likely. But so first, Professor Jiang, what he gives people is not these predictions. A lot of the predictions were made by other people using. I did predict that Trump would be re-elected using other ideas or other experience, and I was fairly confident that the US would attack at one point for the same reasons, like the Netagans and Daniel Schmartenberger and whatnot approaches of the coming energy crisis and the pangs of a dying empire, for instance. But it's what he enriches the ways of thinking, even though I disagree. It's not even disagreeing. I would have a more diverse approach. I would not stick to one theory, whatnot. But it's very interesting to get people who think differently, or people who bring their own ways of thinking, who appropriate the material, appropriate not only the material in the content, but appropriate the methods, devise their own, and bring something that has character, that is individualized. So in a world where things tend to be mass-produced and standardized and then controlled or censored due to adherence to such or such aspect, it's interesting to have new and open points of view. Now the attacks that you would have behind would be, you could have, I've not seen this since he's Chinese, but if he was a European, it would be deemed racist directly for some aspects. He would be attacked on many controversial aspects. He is deeply attacked for his use of secret societies, of all the things that are woven into the narrative of conspiracy theories, complotism in French. So there again, you tend to have sides. So people who observe the workings of shady workings of companies, of finance, crime, and whatnot for a long time, and how these things necessarily are interwoven. They would go for, well, it's just complete nonsense to say that you do not have plots, conspiracies, groups that are not, maybe not so secret, but that follow their own agendas against other groups and whatnot. So the actual definition of what conspiracy theory is may be blurry, because the way it's used implies that anyone questioning any official narrative or any academic narrative of anything is somewhat a conspiracy theorist, including specialists of the fields. So conspiracy theorists or pseudoscientists or whatnot, these are the same type of rhetoric biases. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot push the questioning of the world and get trapped into it. So making it a broad generalization, questioning the world and knowing that you do not know, but knowing that it's for sure that a lot of things are happening, you have a lot of mechanics that are working behind the veils of what you understand. So this is one thing. Projecting that you have the answers just because you have the questions is another thing. So the models that Professor Jiang uses on how the world works and the strata with the top secret societies and whatnot is a model that is interesting as in a diversity of models, diversity of filters, of lenses on how to view the world. It's necessary to project the fact that it very well may be so that in most strata of our society you will find patterns like this. You go to universities, you will find the Ivy Leagues where I went in the US, you have these strong recurrences, this conservation of all the fabrics of secret societies that are not secret, but that are in groups that allow in just certain individuals that are selected for whatever status, wealth, prestige, or performances or whatnot, and that create an society that has deeper relationship inside than outside. You create a disequilibrium that it's already happening between like friendship groups and whatnot. The thing here is that the actual society has an existence of its own. It has an history of its own, and it is not only a group of individuals that have created links between themselves. When they go, the society keeps going. And the fact that these groupings have a strong influence is obvious. Well, it's not that it's obvious, it's that it is deeply documented through time. In the same way as families would have strong effects, or big companies and whatnot. So you have many players of many different levels. Some of the players, for some reasons, tend to be hidden. Obviously, all the illegal world may not be hidden from the people who live in this world, or the people who fight them or whatnot, but they're not obvious, they're not known to the global public. You do not know, except if you watch a journalist speaking about it. You do not know all the workings of all the crime mafias and organized crimes units fighting together in areas that do not affect you directly. You learn about the inner politics and geography and history of Iran because you get at war with it, and you're directly impacted in your economic life and maybe in all other aspects. So the attack on Professor Jiang on this aspect is invalid if the thing is taken as a model, and if the modeling is not taken as a accurate transcription of reality. If it's a working model that has an efficiency, that allows for instance, good predictions, or fairly, or even if it allows not even for good predictions, but in some ways it doesn't matter, if it allows for ways of thinking about the world that would empower or enrich the diversity of the conversation. This is very helpful. The integration of esotericism, of spiritual content, of religion into the fabric of societies, since a lot of the societies, and even our societies, are still deeply based on that, and in many ways you could argue that the type of science that is proclaimed as the science is a god, or is a religion. You believe, you have, most people have absolutely no knowledge of what is referred to when you talk about the science and scientists and the academia. You know nothing of all the theories, of all the diversities, of all the inner fights, but you project a validity and ethos that's based on social conditioning. Since others validate this, then you validate it, or on logos, since you understand the arguments and whatnot and the methods, and you find that they're relevant, then you validate it. Or it could be linked to pathos or kairos or what, but not all the different aspects of the rhetoric, like of the persuasion through language. And so to finish, Professor Jiang Xueqin brings at least a lot of questions and a lot of new ways of inquiring about events for many people, even for some fairly advanced geopolitical analysts, for instance. Because why does he bring something of value and something new? Because he brings his own unique treasure. No, I didn't complete my thinking about the agent approach. So if a guy empowers individuals, it can be an agent or not, it would not matter. If someone makes your life richer, deeper, brings you more self-agency, more ability to act upon your life rather than be a victim of it, and especially if this person is pushing this message actively in a lot of his public discourse, even though the guy can be financed by whatever type of power, in the same way all the people attacking him in say medias that are owned by billionaires, and well, guys, maybe the guy works for such or such force, but so do you. So the fact that he could be attacked, say in the US, by some people he would be attacked because he's giving ways to critique the global policies. By others he would be attacked by saying that is by depicting all the workings of a Trump potential plan and whatnot, is actually giving credit to the ramblings of a madman and pushing people into his clothes, which often when you listen to more of his content, it's not so one-sided or not so simple. So my personal argument is that many people find things that are deep into his work. The danger would be to make it be unique, like turning the prophet into a prophetic figure, like confusing the message with the messenger, and locking the messenger into such an archetypal role that he gets stuck in it. This would be a very, very big problem, or it's already happening somehow, because be it the people watching or the people that are criticizing, is being turned into a public figure, and you can see that it changed the interactions that he has with with the class, it changed the interactions that he may have with the audience. Obviously, it seems to have changed his personal life on some level. So, prophets or public figures, when they become stars, you burn them to get the light. So this is a big issue. It's an issue that may come from people watching. You have people who provide content like this, all the Whitney Weber, all the Orland bishops, who knows. People give their heart or give something to reawaken us to what we are, to our proper agency, to the light within, to light of consciousness, to the ability to shape our world. When they drift, they depict the world as pre-written. So sometimes, especially lately, some of Professor Jiang's content would tend to be he gets ensnared in his trap. The content is still interesting, but what the children or the pupils go out with is not more agency, it's despondency. Or so this would be a problem in some ways. I'll stop here because it's already been too long. It's starting to get really noisy outside. So that's it.